it is my really great pleasure to welcome you tonight for the lecture of our second resident postdoctoral fellow, Jallatyan, who comes to us from the University of California, Irvine, where he completed his PhD in comparative literature in 2019. His passion for literature and comparative literature more specifically is clear from his CV, as he earned his MA from Indiana University as well as his BA from the University of California, Los Angeles in the same field. Dr. Jallatyan was born and raised in Gyumri. You knew that was coming. The second largest city of Armenia, located in the northwestern part of the country. Gyumri, if you did not know this, is also very famous to be the capital of laughter and humor. And hence the city takes laughter serious, and so does Dr. Jallatyan. I'm sure that many of you in the room have witnessed his wicked sense of humor and shared his laughter. And though he takes laughter serious, I wonder if he thinks that laughter is serious. There seems to be a debate that Vahé hinted at last night, so I will be interested in hearing what that take is. But while Dr. Jallatyan draws inspiration from the light-hearted wisdom and exigent creativity of his hometown in his everyday interaction with whoever he encounters, his scholarly endeavor is of an entirely different nature. There are two lines of work that populate this promising scholar's CV. Both, I believe, have grown out from a love for art and literature and walk along similar themes and concepts. Themes and concepts that stand, I would say, in stark contrast to the humorous person we encounter in the hallways and at social gatherings. Violence, sadness, loss, chaos, uncanny, exile, catastrophe, ruins, afterlives. Those are the words that would be the hashtag for Jallatyan's scholarly Twitter feed. Dr. Jallatyan dedicates significant time to translation with a particular emphasis on making works written and composed in Armenian accessible to an Anglophone audience. As we know, national literature is often considered as monolingual and as representing national identity. However, instead of harping on national identity, Jallatyan sees Diaspora, Armenian works written in Armenia, as inscribing the post-catastrophic and post-national experience of dispersion. His beautiful translation of Beirut-born Vahé Oshagan's poems, published in a recent Absent, which is a scholarly journal on campus here, shows his appreciation for language and highlights Dr. Jallatyan's enthrallment and engagement with the darker moments of the human condition, as well as his effort of making the violence that informs and underlies diasporic art visible and readable to an audience that instinctively would reject its presence. One of Tekion's poems translated by Dr. Jallatyan speaks to this most poignantly. Tekion writes, "The ruins call intensely with their stubborn gaze. They bury all novelistic forms. They bury the epic, the bread, the wine, the song, the drought, fertility. The anthells multiply under the sun. Lives these strong-winded ruins. Like an insoluble truth, drop by drop, they ooze their hearts to the earth. While the breeze, like a startled herd, passes from country to country, as if a cursed legion far off the eye, hiding its sins, submerges in the cerulean instability to tell the rest of the myth. The eye opens, and millions of people drop by drop are descended to the earth. The tribes multiply, like fate arranged side by side and absurdly tourniqueted. And we wait for someone to murder the spies of pain." As somewhat of a spy of pain himself, Dr. Jallatyan has thought deeply, I quote, about the problematic nature of translating poetry and transposing formal and semantic configuration from one language to another, hoping to give an afterlife to a poem that grapples with the flickers of meaning that envelop us from the unpatterned chaos of life. Unquote. It is these flickers of meaning and unpatterned chaos of life that have drawn Dr. Jallatyan to the writers and artists that make up the analytical part of his work. From the Canadian Armenian filmmakers Adam Negorian and Gary Netorosyan, whose films are emblematic of fragmented narratives that defy chronology and engage with and thematize post-exilic diasporic consciousness by explicitly developing a discourse of impossible return to the homeland. To the poet Vahé Oshagan, whose work makes up a significant portion of Dr. Jallatyan's dissertation, Becoming Diaspora, Global Armenian Literature and Film after 1950. In his dissertation and a separate book project on Oshagan himself, Dr. Jallatyan highlights the poet's interpretation of the Armenian catastrophe in absurdist terms. Both the poet and the scholar here are resisting a dominant Armenian tendency to see the past in conventional nationalist and historicist logics that are antithetical to the diasporic conditions of life. Furthermore, to draw out the experience of dispersion as one that's clearly not unique to Armenians, Dr. Jallatyan views Armenian diasporic artistic expression in conversation with Caribbean, African, and North American indigenous literary and visual arts. Herein I argues that, I quote, figures of survival which expectantly permeate the artistic and intellectual discourse of these communities, to rely on a poetics of creative catastrophe. Through it, the surviving community strives to incorporate the catastrophic past into its attempt to invent a new configuration of belonging. Something that we saw last night was central to Oshagan's project and personal struggle. Jallatyan asks us, how can unbearable events of destruction serve as impetus for identity construction? In other words, while embracing life after this deadliest of experiences is deeply touching, he says the poetry of creative catastrophe can expose the limit of our discursive dichotomies of destruction and creation, loss and mourning, past and future. Like Oshagan, then a man who thought his work as successful if he was able to get a tiny step closer to the truth. A man who thought that human existence was meaningless, absurd really. A man who saw estrangement as the essential human condition. A man who wrote to save his life. A man who saw and perhaps feared the chaos of the world. Dr. Jallatyan, in his work, revels in the pandemonium that defines the diasporic experience, and like the poet, aims to perhaps introduce a bit of order to the chaos. And therewith, I would like to welcome Aaron to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you for such an extremely humbling introduction. I should begin by conveying a feeling of deep gratitude to the community of the University of Michigan Armenian Studies program, to its director Melanie Tanyelian in particular for inviting me to speak today. It is truly a remarkable honor for me as a Manoogian Postdoctoral Fellow to give this lecture on Vahé Oshagan before such a distinguished audience. I know quite well many of you and am humbled by your presence. Without your ongoing support, I would not be here today. Thank you also for, thank you. I also look forward to becoming acquainted with new faces, some of new faces, maybe not too many new faces, but that's okay. And I thank all of you for being here. Yesterday, some of us had the good fortune of attending the artist talk by Heray Armani Yulmesekyan, who is among us today, as well as the screening of the experimental documentary Vahé Oshagan Between Acts. In addition to its many merits, the film gives a rather thorough biographical sketch of Vahé Oshagan. For that reason, in my lecture today, I will keep to the minimum such observations and will mention only those details only when necessitated by occasion. Nevertheless, for those who did not attend the film screening yesterday, I'll make some brief introductory remarks, biographical remarks. All right. Vahé Oshagan was born in 1922 in Bulgaria and lived in Cyprus and Jerusalem. Hagop Oshagan, the outstanding Western Armenian writer, critic and teacher, was his father. Vahé Oshagan's first work of fiction, a short story titled Birader Hagop, or Protestant Hagop, was published in 1945 and won a literary prize. After the war, Oshagan moved to Paris, where he learned French for about a year and then studied literature at the Sorbonne. He moved to Beirut in the early 1950s and threw himself into a very active, provocative literary, pedagogical, literary, critical, and public intellectual life. He moved to, some of his most daring works are written and published in Beirut. After the break of the Lebanese Civil War, Oshagan moved to the United States, where he taught in universities in Philadelphia and San Francisco. In the 1990s, he lived and taught in Australia and visited newly independent Armenia. His itinerant life reflects the diaspora that he wrote and thought for about half a century. Vahé Oshagan is first and foremost an iconoclastic poet. His poetry struggles to approach and measure up to the Armenian condition of dispersion, a post-catastrophic and post-national condition, as I shall attempt to demonstrate again today. As a son of Hagop Oshagan, Vahé Oshagan was destined more than anyone else to confront and displace the inherited Western Armenian tradition, literary intellectual tradition. And this struggle is one of the most epic dimensions of his work. The point of entry and the driving force of the reading that I will conduct today is the problematic of the possibility of art in a tragically absurd universe. So I'll repeat it just kind of in a slow motion manner. The problematic of the possibility of art in an absurd universe. This problematic runs through Oshagan's early works of criticism. Let's just go there slowly. And informs a constellation of themes and tropes which will prove profitable to trace in his literary works. So I will start with his literary criticism and then I'll jump into his literature, but without reducing one or into the other, sort of like independently mirroring one into the other. Far from being an exercise in solipsism, such a reading strives to take into account Oshagan's diverse and prolific output without privileging the irreducible discourses of culture criticism and its objects, quote-unquote objects, prose, poetry, theater, and literary criticism, basically. Such an approach, more importantly, tries to read Oshagan's oeuvre on its own terms, which I argue gives us the best chance of not reducing the open-ended diasporic experience inscribed in and through his works into the pre-given theoretical frameworks of post-colonial, ethnic, and area studies, as well as multiculturalism. Vahé Oshagan, the literary critic, the sixth essay of the 1962-1963 series, European and American Modern Literature, published in Pagin, is in the sixth essay, an important and quick note about Pagin, it's an important Beirut-based Armenian language periodical created in 1962, so on the year of its creation. Oshagan formulates the problematic of the possibility of art in a tragic universe in the following way. So I have the Armenian and then I'll read the English. Indeed, and here lies the greatest obstacle or inner contradiction of the theater of the absurd. If the absurd is presented as such, then it will be left outside the limit of art because art presupposes the control of reason. That is, it is conditioned by the effect of some synthesis within chaos. And if the absurd is presented as art, it will cease from being absurd. So we have this double bind. Even though the immediate context of Oshagan's discussion above is the post-war European theater of the absurd, the text formulates the problematic in general terms. Accordingly, art presupposes synthesis in chaos, which is another name of the absurd and does not tolerate any synthesis. This way, it is also to be understood that the absurd escapes realist and positivist representation. To better understand the stakes and complexities of this problematic, let us take a closer look at the ways the notions of art and the absurd are deployed in Oshagan's early literary criticism. True to its title, the series European and American Modern Literature describes and evaluates what for Oshagan appear to be the main currents of contemporary literary life in Western Europe, the United States, and the Soviet Union. In the earlier essays of the same series, Oshagan discusses the major cultural shifts taking place in Europe from the 19th to the 20th centuries as a background that informs contemporary culture. He then analyzes the conditions and qualities of European cultural life after World War II and claims that in philosophy, the disenchantment following the war has led to the strengthening of existentialist views among thinkers. I cite the following paragraph from the second essay of the series, significant for his thinking of the absurd in existentialist terms. First, in philosophy, existentialism is not to be something new and does not elevate a descent or ascent all the way to the Socrates. But wherever it goes, very few times was it able to get out of the metaphysical lived experience among scattered individuals. For post-war writers and philosophers, it turned into a sensibility of living, comprehending and judging life. Existentialism, with its negative side, rejected the easy, wounded human illusions, disavowed happiness and social values. But with its positive side, it turned all the projectors of the universe towards the human standing on the empty stage. It pushed, it pulled, and it threw him to feel with pride, despair, and humanness the emptiness left after a deserted God and a diseased morality. The philosophy, psychology, sociology, and so on developed in this direction, stayed and stay solely European phenomena. And so for Oshagan, a collective European existentialism is what marks the post-war period. And I want to emphasize the collective part. As for the distinction between a positive and negative side to existentialism, one can hear echoes of the Camus 1942 essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, essay on the absurd. I will skip the part where I point to a couple of details from Camus. In his further allusions to existentialism, Oshagan emphasizes the possibility of freedom for the human being faced with the absurd. For instance, in his 1965 essay on Sartre, written in the wake of Sartre's rejection of the Nobel Prize, Oshagan first refuses to characterize existentialism as a philosophy or a system of thought. Now here's a longer paragraph, which I will not read. And here is the Armenian, kind of in a larger context. I just want to open a quick parenthetical. I want us to see these pages because in my opinion, it's for the first time that we're actually reading these pages written some 70 years ago. One of the issues with diasporan culture is memory. And I think this work of unearthing and showing these pages and looking at the text structure even or the texture of things is important. So I'm using these images that were taken, like I mentioned on the PowerPoint, by Sonia Kiledjan and Rafi Ajemian, who are actually the current editors of Pagin. Just kind of keep the traces not hidden, as it were, of where things are coming from. So in this passage, maybe I can go back to the English. As its last words indicates, Oshagan formulates art by way of Sartre's existentialism as the testimony of a lived experience. So I've highlighted those two elements that I want to focus on a little bit. Art, therefore, is the exertion to reconcile the deceitful, instantaneous, formless truth of existence with the consciousness of that existence. What is crucial to note at this stage of my analysis is the problematical form that emerges. Notice that I start with that double bind that Oshagan formulates. If it's chaos, then it cannot be represented. If you represent, it's not chaos. So there's that double bind. Here it takes this problematic takes the form of form, if I may put it that way. It is one form of this formulation about form is one form of the double bind with which I began this talk, and which will help us interpret the formal experimentations of Oshagan's own literary works. So there's the problematic of the absurd, but then there's the problematic of form. The link between art and existentialist witnessing is already quite explicit in the second essay of the European and American Modern Literature series, where Oshagan elaborates the role of the artist in an absurd world thus. So here's one more. As the above passage indicates, the idea of art as the existentialist witnessing of the tragedy of this absurd universe informs Oshagan's conception of the writer-intellectual. as independent from social and moral systems of valuation, an independent witness in a sense. He develops this notion in this series of essays and performs it as a public intellectual. As for the negative side of the existentialist critique, remember with the paragraph on Sartre, there the positive side and the negative side, it necessitates for Oshagan a break from the 19th century and earlier realist, romanticist, and Platonist attempts to grounding meaning. So there's a big break against the way Armenian literature is being read in his time, whether they're transcendental way of grounding meaning or immanent. And his critique of Armenian literature relies on and demands such a break. And I will elaborate on these claims that I'm making a bit more, but this is just a little opening about the Vahé Oshagan, the literary critic. And I want again to draw attention to the fact that these are very early essays. The year when Pagin was founded, there are this series of essays that are published already. As Vahé Oshagan's aforementioned series itself already specifies, post-war cultural transformations in Europe cannot be explained by existentialism alone. Similarly, the problematic of the possibility of art in the face of the absurd in Oshagan's criticism is not limited to strictly existentialist terminology and figures. An instance of this is Oshagan's essay on Samuel Beckett, which relegates absurdist existentialist motifs into the background and focuses on language as the site where meaning is necessarily cut and thwarted. Oshagan writes in the opening paragraph. Here's the opening paragraph. Just one word about Yeridasart High, this publication. I believe it started in the 1970s, maybe. This might be the first volume. And it was not necessarily literary critical publication, but it did have a column for intellectual kind of literary interventions. In the beginning, there was silence. In the end, there was silence again, with a difference. For the second, there is the taste of the rotting corpse in the mouth. It is the language, the Hermesian pedestal, the pasteboard throne hanging over abysses, where now morbid symbols of word and meaning try to crawl and leave. But to no avail. Tragic and fatal, the meaninglessness of life pressures the brain from inside and outside. With the morning light and the night darkness, despair permeates inside the human. Life is impossible in the world and everything. Without having started to even leave, human or object already rots. The only great sin, adds Beckett, is the sin of having come to the world. Very uplifting paragraph. Towards the end of the above passage, Oshagan claims that everything rots. How can such a claim be made with any certainty when language is the taste of the rotting corpse in the mouth, as the beginning of the passage situates or states? The motive of rotting thus is a locus of the circular paradox, constitutive of the discourse claiming language to be the site of the absurd. This discourse, moreover, aims to displace Christian theology by intertextually evoking motifs from it, as is the case with the formulation in the beginning there was. In the beginning there was in Armenian, Iharaj iskizbane, which is also very biblical. Yeah. And the citation from Beckett alludes to the notion of original sin. These elements mark the emergence of a mystical discourse in Oshagan, which becomes more explicit in the section White Silence of the same essay. There, Oshagan writes, "The true Beckett has gone beyond the absurd and has felt the first touch of the cold breath of the white, great silence. His life and work are the evidence of this." End of quote. The trope of the beyond is a well-known and common trope in Christian mysticism. Scholars have written a lot about the tropes of mysticism abounding in Beckett's work. Shira Wolosky, to give one example, argues that Beckett's work conceives of language as quote, no longer a mere instrument for its own surpassing, but the very framework defining mystical conduct and goals. End of quote. Oshagan's essay on Beckett is not just aware of the circular paradox of using language to undermine language, but thrives on it. An example is the synesthesia in the formulation, the first touch of the cold breath of the white great silence, which disrupts basic empirical categories, formative of language, by triangulating tactile, visual, spatial, and auditory absences. The result is no ordinary figuration or image, but a non-image, a figure of a negative sublime. As I shall gradually demonstrate, Oshagan's early writings grow within precisely such a paradoxical literary space of using language to undermine it. Later, when his texts suggest love to be the answer to the absurdity of the world, notably by invoking the 11th century Armenian mystic poet Gregor of Narek, there seems to be an even more deeply paradoxical attempt to speculate about the beyond instead of merely implying it. Lastly, despite admiring him, Oshagan does offer a careful criticism of Beckett's work. Oshagan writes, there is still the possibility of refusing the freedom of rebelling. If God is dead, it does not mean that the human is dead. The people of Beckett lack this stubborn, inexplicable zealousness. End of quote. In other words, Oshagan paradoxically criticizes Beckett's literature as short-selling the absurd possibility of hopelessly rebelling in the face of the absurd. As a self-conscious and self-proclaimed Armenian language diaspora writer, Oshagan sometimes views the struggle of Western Armenians forced into exile as a hopeless, unheroic attempt to rebel in the face of this absurd tragedy. His literature, therefore, is an attempt to realize his freedom, as well as offer it to his readers as a reminder and encouragement to live freely. In Oshagan's criticism, the problematic of the possibility of art in an absurd universe, in addition to being elaborated through existentialism and language and giving rise to the figure of the free public intellectual, is formulated also through literary form. We had an inkling of this when he started talking about form. This is not surprising given the problematic of form in Oshagan's interpretation of existentialism, which we saw above. Every time I make a comment, I realize that I've actually written that already. Moreover, which is a good sign, I think. It's a good omen. Moreover, in the Samuel Beckett essay, Oshagan writes, quote, theater, novel, short story, tragedy, comedy, description, psychological analysis, it is superfluous to search for a motto because Beckett creates outside of them. End of quote. This implies that for Oshagan, one way art actualizes freedom is through breaking away from inherited artistic conventions. Yet despite conceiving art as transgressive, in his literary criticism, Oshagan seems to approve of one inherited literary form, that of the epic. In September 1962, there it is, Oshagan published in Pagin again, an essay titled William Faulkner. This is on the left side. As already mentioned, his text appeared between the fourth and the fifth installments of the series discussed above and was occasioned by Faulkner's passing. I want to pause and say one more thing. Here we have an example of an intellectual community in Beirut keeping up with the world literary events. I think that's very exemplary. Sartre is refusing a Nobel Prize. There's an article about that. Something else happens in intellectual world, there's an article about that. In this article, Oshagan describes Faulkner as a novelist, poet, writer of epic, quote unquote. He further claims that hailing from the South, which unlike the North has suffered a defeat, and by writing about the South's bittersweet decline and imminent disappearance, Faulkner arrives at fundamental truths about human tragedy, human destiny. Over numerous volumes, Oshagan claims Faulkner recreates more intensely the South struck by tragedy, in all its contradiction, in its deep feeling of guilt for what it has done to the African Americans. By doing so, Faulkner reveals the truth of natural harmony achieved over the moral chaos of life by those who are capable of love and pity, have the courage to endure tragedy, die for the sake of something greater, and are humble and proud at the same time. This is just a brief summary. As the above summary indicates, Oshagan reads Faulkner's epic as an intensifying depiction of a lost world. Pardon me. The key point here is the intensifying depiction of a lost world. However, in the series, Oshagan discusses the negative side of existentialism as exposing the meaninglessness of inherited values. We have explosion on the one hand, intensification on the other hand. In this sense, existentialist critique demythologizes and therefore, one would expect, rejects the epic. When it exposes, it's rejecting the epic. This is kind of my contention. And so when Oshagan endorses the epic in literature, he does so in a demythologizing manner, under the condition that the epics serve to witness the tragic absurdity of human existence. Therefore, Oshagan's meditations on myth reappropriate the epic, by O. Faulkner, for instance, as a form of inscribing the absurd. And hence the phrase, which is supposed to be oxymoronic, at least to some extent, epic demythologization. Epic demythologization is peculiar to Oshagan's approach and tone, particularly when writing about Armenian literature. His essays on the late 19th and 20th century Armenian and non-Armenian writers such as Grigor Zorhab, Yerukhan, Hagop Oshagan, Axel Baguns, Shahan Shanur, Paris Sevak, Victor Hugo, and others systematically evaluate the effects that public myths created around these authors have on the reception of their literature. For instance, when writing about Shahan Shanur, the writer was born in 1903, he passed away in 1974, born in Istanbul, but then wrote and lived in Paris. Oshagan interrogates the conditions under which this Paris-based Western Armenian writer was mythologized as a rebel in the imagination of the Armenian public. This is from a 1974 article in Young Armenian. In another article, Shahandur and Us, Oshagan points out how, like a few other Western Armenian writers, Shahandur also created a myth around himself, which went beyond and obfuscated his work. This attempt at demythologization partially explains the provocative rhetoric adopted by Oshagan in his literary criticism, self-consciously lashing out at the sensibilities of his readers. A case in point is the essay Zorhab and Yerukhan, published in Bakin in April 1965, marking the 50th anniversary of the Armenian catastrophe, and therefore a highly symbolic date for its readership. This article, which assesses the works of the Istanbul Armenian writer Grigor Zorhab and Yerukhan, both of whom fell victims to the catastrophe, provocatively states that from the literary point of view, Armenians did not lose much with their murder. This is pure Vahé Oshagan on this date. Regarding Zorhab, who is especially revered among Armenians, the opening two sentences of the essay say it all. Quote, "It was death that brought somewhat closer these opposing persons and literary temperaments. But Zorhab's literary temperament had already started to die when they killed him, and Western Armenian literature did not lose much with his disappearance." End of quote. As for Yerukhan, Oshagan claims that he produced mediocre literature, but having lived longer probably would have been able to overcome his mediocrity. So this is on the 50th anniversary of the catastrophe, about writers who are revered and heroized and etc., etc. This is talking about demythologization, the act, the process. Oshagan's critical reflections on myth, the epic, and literature include his analysis of the work of Western Armenian writer Axel Baguns, who passed away, you have his life. I think it should be 1937.
Absolutely.
Yes. There is a mistake, it should be 1937. Who, like so many Armenian and other pre-Soviet intellectuals, fell victim to Stalin's Great Purge. Baguns' literature for Oshagan is not realist and has an epic quality. It reflects on the life-giving force of the imagination, which Oshagan speculates might have been the key to the survival of the Armenian people in the face of grave tragedies. Yet for some reason, his writings do not touch upon the core tragedy of human existence, a profound reality that Oshagan further claims goes beyond language and the nation. Okay, now having set the stage, as it were, of Vahé Oshagan as a literary critic, I'll turn to his literature. I want to start first, with let me just read this actually. So now that I turn towards Oshagan's literature, I want to make sure that we think of his text as struggling with received genre conventions. My hope is to demonstrate that the terms of this struggle strongly echo the problematic of the possibility of art in an absurd universe. Vahé Oshagan published his first volume of poetry, Baduhan, Window, in Beirut in 1956, shortly after moving there from Paris. It is, however, with his second volume, City, Kawak, published in 1963, it should be visible there, that Oshagan's work acquired lasting significance. This volume is the earliest and quintessential instance of epic demythologization performed by Oshagan, The entry of city gives a panoramic view of an unidentified city under the morning light. Paradoxically, the city is a place where human beings are forbidden to really encounter each other, something that exposes the absurdity of their existence. Through figures such as the prison guard, the porter, the judge, the smuggler, the prostitute, the teacher, and the doctor, the poem describes absurd states of human existence. The different sections of the volume elaborate on the places where humans lead their absurd existence. So more or less this is kind of a quick sketch of the work. What is more, as a place of inauthenticity par excellence, the city looks for at least a single witness to it, which it cannot find. Oshagan's poetry is meant to be this witness. At the end of the opening section of City, Oshagan writes, do I have it? Yeah, I think I have it. The city, I'm reading this part. The city that gathers thousands of people, but does not equal to one man's, one room's, one unpostponable and erroneous yearning. Accordingly, city describes not just the distractions from the meaninglessness of life that constitutes the city, but also the more powerful, unpostponable and erroneous yearning for meaning. And as Mark Nishanyan has read this, and we saw this interpretation a little bit in the film yesterday, there is the covering up of the meaning is the very meaning itself in the city, and the city is trying to expose that covering up. I will skip a little bit. What is crucial for us to note in the context of our exploration of the nature of diasporic Armenian literature is that Oshagan's absurdist inscriptions create a post-national and post-catastrophic diasporic literature. To begin with the full title of the volume is City, an epic. An epic volume 1. Karag, 2002 Hador Ayp. Among other senses, the word which I'm translating as epic, and which one could translate as epopee or epopeia, alludes to the Armenian epic The Daredevils of Sasun, Sasna Zerer. Dating from the 8th century, it recounts a successful Armenian rebellion against the domination of the Islamic Empire. Unlike the Daredevils of Sasun, written down in the 19th century and giving impetus to the formation of modern Armenian national consciousness, Oshagan's epic hardly falls within national logic. Instead, it strives to witness the meaninglessness of human existence. Moreover, a specifically post-national moment is inscribed in the beginning of the section titled Cabaret, where Oshagan writes. Here's that section, Cabaret, and I'm going to read somewhere from here. He writes, along the banks of Mother Arax, the fatherland stretches up to the borders of the dress. So, my Araxi Aperov, Hayrenikë Gëdaradzi Minchev Sahmanները Zgestin. Here, along the banks of Mother Arax, is a line from an Armenian patriotic poem, The Tears of Arax, by Raphael Batkanyan, a poet of the second half of the 19th century. Arax is a river that marks the southeastern border of Armenia. Patkanyan's emotionally charged poem anthropomorphizes Arax by having her, quote-unquote, speak of the country's erstwhile greatness, in contrast to its current dismal state. Oshagan's poem distances itself from a national territorial logic by resituating Patkanyan's memorable line as part of an absurdist inscriptions of city. And as the line, the fatherland stretches up to the borders of the dress implies, it does this by ironically suggesting that in the consciousness of a survivor of a national catastrophe, the longing for national homeland still lingers. That's the absurd. The exposure of this longing as absurd allows reading the city as an epic on the impossibility of the national epic. By evoking the epic, Oshagan's work mobilizes its collective and collecting powers. It does this, however, by displacing the national epic and in this manner inaugurates diaspora. This is how Oshagan's work is post-national and post-catastrophic. Now I'll turn to Oshagan's prose. Analyzing all of Oshagan's works of prose in one essay or in one presentation will be impossible and unfairly reductive. Instead, here I will try to point out the key motifs playing out in Oshagan's criticism that emerge in his works of prose. Overall, I have collected some 45 short stories by Oshagan from the 1945 up to the 1990s period. scattered in the Diaspora press, some of them unpublished and most of them collected in the volumes The Fugitive, Pakhastagana, Around the Trap, Tagartin Shurch, and Generations, Serunner. There are also 3 novels, Breach, Gamurch, Inoculation, Badvasta, and Premonitory, Hervandan, of which only the middle one has been published. And here you see a very short list of what there is. Oshagan's earliest prose, Birader or Protestant Hagop and the Cafe, is distinctly pre-absurdist. The Cafe is driven by plot and contains few thick descriptions of mental embodied experience of characters. Only indirect overtones of the absurd and the tragic, mixed with some comedy, can be read in it. Birader Hagop contains thick descriptions. This relatively longer text describes only a single evening, yet the narrative perspective created by this description is not formulated as witnessing the absurd. Additionally, the short story Night is arguably the first of its kind in Oshagan's work of prose, treating of the national revolutionary struggle of the Armenian people. It has heroic characters and fedais, basically. Such works of prose by Oshagan are largely plot-driven, contain relevant symbolism, and later ones will contain political and ideological content. Only with the short story Curtain do distinct absurdist concerns formulated in existentialist terms emerge in Oshagan's prose. But I will skip and I will actually read about Father and Son, which I think is remarkable. A later, as far as I know, unpublished short story entitled Father and Son also lends itself to an absurdist existentialist reading, but differently than the short story Curtain. Father and Son is about a middle-aged couple, Reverend Hagop and Azniv, and their 6-year-old son, Hosep, who dies at the end of the first part of the story. In part 2, the couple returns home after their son's funeral. The text describes the couple's mental and embodied experience during their son's illness and then the couple mourning their son's loss. What makes this story distinctly absurdist is first of all the plot element of the death of an innocent child. A tragedy that does not obey any moral rationale and stands for the absurdity of the universe. This absurd, and by the way, there is a lot of Dostoevsky, and Oshagan a lot mentions Dostoevsky in the criticism from this time. This absurd narrative strand is complemented by another. While Azniv is more pragmatically grounded on her faith and relies on her husband's prayers, merely hearing whose voice gives her comfort, Hagop has a difficult time finding the words when faced with such an absurd loss, of entering into the sermonizing mode with which he is so familiar. In part 2, Reverend Hagop continues to wait. Since he is so attached to religious texts and sermonizing, gaining deep sense of security from them, he waits for words to emerge and help him live through this difficult moment. No words come to the Reverend. He walks into their son's room where Azniv is crying while leaning on his bed. The narrative shifts and takes Azniv's perspective, and who asks Hagop to pray. He's having a difficult time to even pray, feels tired, wishes the Bible were with him, and bursts into tears. They cry, hugging each other. Then Hagop falls asleep. That's basically the narrative. Such an arbitrary ending reinforces the absurd in the short story, the element of the absurd. Just like Hagop's long-winded attempt to make sense of his loss is subverted by an absurd element, which fuels the search for meaning without itself having any meaning. Okay. I'm going to speak a little bit longer about 2 or 3 other categories of readings that Vahé Oshagan's work presents, categories of texts. And then I will make some final remarks about the discourse of diaspora that can be kind of read from these texts. So Vahé Oshagan's meta-allegorical prose. On July 19, I guess we can go here. On July 19, 1975, Oshagan published a text in newspaper Astag titled Perspective. I say 1 because there's Perspective 2, but Perspective 1 doesn't have 1, so 1 is in brackets. As far as I know, this is the first highly allegorical text by Oshagan. If this is the case, then Perspective marks the advent of a new stage in Oshagan's prose. It tells the story of Hayrabet and his 3 sons who live in an Armenian village in Lebanon. This is why he thinks, in Lebanon, Hayrabet believes that true fatherland and identity consist in constant escape and searching. This is why he thinks that his villagers hardly live their lives, given the soporific security that they find among themselves. By contrast, he one by one sends his 3 sons away, hoping that with their experience of exile, they will understand and embrace the deeper truth about fatherland and identity. However, all of the sons come back. There's a lot of irony in Vahé Oshagan. Hayrabet is disappointed that they did not break the law of the father to create new life, and recalls how in his youth he was also not able to resist the feeling of homesickness and returned. That's perspective 1. Perspective 1 has allegorical qualities. Its narrative does not provide any detailed character descriptions. Instead, they function as archetypes. Moreover, their names are symbolic. The name of the middle son, Avedis, means good news, as it is in the Bible. Ironically, Hayrabet literally means the main father, or the chief father, if I may put it that way. It is clear that he represents a father figure. His 3 sons returning after exile stand for the failure to live authentically through transgression and transplantation. What makes this short story meta-allegorical is the fact that the interpretation of the allegory accompanies the narrative itself. It is my opinion that conventional allegories, they're just like in Kafka, for instance, the interpretation is left to the reader. But Vahé Oshagan's allegories, they give you the interpretation already, it's there. Hence the meta-allegorical dimension. There's another meta-allegorical short story. There are many, but I'll skip that one because I feel like I could touch upon other interesting things. Okay. Vahé Oshagan's meta-historiographic theater. Meta-historiographic theater. Theater as an art form is within Oshagan's critical purview from an early date. Already in the series that I mentioned, European American Modern Literature, and Samuel Beckett, through which we trace the problematic of the art in the face of the tragically absurd universe, they rely significantly on evaluating works of theater in making their assessments. Oshagan, over the years, kept steady critical relations with theater. He wrote 5 theater reviews, which he published in the Beirut-based Armenian daily Astak in the mid-1970s, and the 4 ones in Asparas in the 1980s. Oshagan's rhetoric in these theater texts, especially in Astak reviews, adopts a strategic pattern. He opens them by making broad theoretical remarks about the nature of theater, pointing out its cultural and political importance and reflecting and shaping the quality of a community's collective life. Without reducing theater to only one of its my-right aspects, Oshagan emphasizes the freedom from the everyday that it can potentially give to its audience, a theme that echoes his existentialist criticism. Then he discusses the particular play that has been recently performed and ends the review by critically assessing the performance. That's his strategy. Throughout these reviews, he endorses the idea of a national theater, but only one which is conceived with artistic terms and goals that take into account the issues affecting not just Armenians, but humanity in general. He's very careful and very explicit what he means by national theater. This is Oshagan's way of reconciling the particular with the universal. So here's a list of the works of theater by Oshagan. I think there is more. That's why I'm saying almost incomplete, so to be added. I have marked with color the ones that are historiographic, that deal with the past, the national past. I want to read my analysis of one of those, because I think it's more fun. The link between language and the problematic of the possibility of art in the absurd universe is most explicitly treated in Oshagan's 1962 play, The Dysfunctional Elevator. And forgive me the translations. If you have any better ways of translating, let me know. The dysfunctional elevator is the Khangarvats Verilag. Oh, there we go. Khangarvats Verilagը. Radio sketch 6 ձայնի համար 2 ժամանակ. The Dysfunctional Elevator, radio sketch for 6 voices, 2 durations. The play evokes the historical figures of Mesrop Mashtots and Goryun. Mashtots is the 4th and 5th century Armenian linguist, theologian who spearheaded the creation of the Armenian letters around the year of 405. His disciple Goryun is best known for Mashtots' biography, Life of Mashtots, the first original book in Armenian. towards the end of the play, an irritated Mashdod says, words, they choked me, the letters one by one are magnificent, pure music. But when they come together and create word and threading on you rise to dance, when the words are arranged next to each other, there is no more air left to breathe. And the idea is curling over the laps of these words. You think your lover is waiting for you, and suddenly an ugly old whore with a disgusting makeup smiles to you with saliva running, itching. Oh, how I was deceived, betrayed. So first of all, nothing is sacred about Mr. Mashdod, and he's a saint for the church, for the Armenian church. This passage captures as much of what I will call Oshagan's literary mysticism. The grotesque and provocative image of language being a whore is at the heart of this discourse. Language, written or spoken, is only a secondary substitute to deeper truth beyond it. To Koryun's reaction that Mashdod is pessimistic while being recognized as one of the greatest contributors to the Armenian culture, Mashdod's response: I'm not that sure about this. The future of Armenians worries me, Koryun. To put so much passion in forgetting the old religion, to cling to the new one, to letter and literature, to the visible with so much zeal. I don't know. Koryun is saying, but letter and literature are magnificent things. Mashdod, only if one does not fall victim to them. Victim? Language was means for me, like mirror, to live beyond it here. End of quote. What is beyond language, we might ask? In Oshagan's discourse, like in the excerpts above, at stake is life, even its essence. The here, exclamation mark, quote unquote, and the implied now, announced by Mashdod, is another formulation of this mythical stand. Life, unlike language, needs to be lived without the deferral that is language. Later, Mashdod adds, quote, time is silence, virgin and pregnant silence. Woe to the one who feels with it words and letters. End of quote. This brings us full circle. Language, words, is a decadent substitute. Silence, beyond language, is virgin and pregnant. And I want to make note about the essay on Beckett, the Great White Silence, the figure of the silence. The dysfunctional elevator presents itself as an artistic act of historical existentialist witnessing of an originary crisis by setting up an unequal binary. Mashdod is the artist, a creator of a script, and unlike Koryun, he is not entangled in its rationalizing, instrumentalizing logic. Mashdod knows how to disentangle from language's entanglements, while Koryun, especially by writing Mashdod's laudatory biography, the first original book in Armenian, like I said, seems forever trapped. In addition to Koryun, Mashdod has another, but this time more equal foil in the play, Vartan Mamigonian. Oshagan presents the Armenian military leader as a mystic figure, ready to sacrifice his life in a hopeless act of rebellion and on his way to acquiring the mystic wisdom that Mashdod has. So we have basically a post-Beckettian version of Vartan Mamigonian in Vahé Oshagan's hands. This is how the past is being reshaped by Oshagan's discourse. For Oshagan, the event of the invention of the Armenian script, which subsequently becomes a substrate of the culture, is analogous to a mystical experience. Both inscribe the paradoxical necessity of creating and or using language to transcend it. This need for transcendence exposes the positivist logic of the archive at the heart of contemporary historiography. Literature exploits this logic when at the end of the dysfunctional elevator, Mashdod burns his papers at the end of the play. Or radio sketch. Okay, I will make some general remarks about Diaspora now, because I think time is of matter. And then in the Q&A session, I would be happy to talk about love as well, as a response to the absurd in Oshagan. One could continue reading from Oshagan's works and point to unique instances of the refigurations of the various tropes and discursive moments that echo his earlier existentialist absurdist concerns. Instead of doing that, I will make some final remarks about the diasporic implications of Oshagan's contributions. What do they tell us about the Armenian diaspora? What do these works' narratives amount to? What kinds of possibilities lie hidden in them? Oshagan's oeuvre constitutes a moment of encounter between the post-war experience of existential crisis evaluation and the Armenian experience of post-catastrophic dispersion. The transformations of that crisis in the hands of Oshagan across the decades are one way of historicizing this encounter. And to historicize is to think. A history of the Armenian diaspora of the 20th century, at least that of its literature and intellectual life, could be written from this perspective, as a history of encounters and displacements. It will also call us to think of history as a series of diasporic displacements. Displacement, in the case of Oshagan, is not a matter of merely being influenced by European philosophical discourse of the existentialist absurd. Oshagan's significance lies in using this discourse to think the diaspora Armenian condition. The inverse is equally significant. There are few other such striking instances in which one cultural tradition, I don't think I can say this word now, at the same time, simultaneously receives term from another to think its condition in a way that arguably even enriches the meanings of the received terms. In other words, the existentialist discourse acquires, in my opinion, deeper meaning when we think how it has been received by an experience of an entire people. Not just a couple of artists and a couple of philosophers and a city that is having an existentialist crisis. I'm talking about Paris or a certain period. In other words, the existentialist crisis experienced by post-European Europe acquires a concrete profundity when used to think the post-national and post-catastrophic dispersions of Armenians. One can distinguish two and double principles of diasporic displacements. First principle, the Armenian diaspora, to be true to its name, has to displace its inherited tradition. In and of itself, this constitutes a call for critical thinking to anyone who desires and declares to contribute to the cultural production of the Armenian diaspora. These contributors should not, as is too often the case, fall into the trap of easy and repetitive sentimental reinvocations of things Armenian and think that they are helping the cause of diaspora. Diaspora Armenian culture. Instead, they should critically interrogate the very foundations of what here and there has constituted Armenian culture. The case of Vahé Oshagan is especially striking since here we are dealing with a double crisis of paternity. After all, Oshagan is the son of Hagop Oshagan. I would like to devote a whole series of lectures on the ways in which Hagop Oshagan's literature informs Vahé Oshagan's works, on the ways in which the latter has read the former across decades. And they change. You can recognize when the different kinds of interpretations that Vahé Oshagan has of Hagop Oshagan's works of Hagop Oshagan across the decades. Generally speaking, the diaspora artist, if by diaspora we intend something substantially new, we mean something substantially new, has to rise against tradition while staying true to it. This is the paradox. Diaspora is calling to be the place of the tradition of the anti-tradition. It has to be able to break new ground while not completely cutting its umbilical cord from the very traditions out of which it has emerged. This implies knowing the archive of the inheritance. First of all, being and gathering an archive, which is what I'm doing, which is what I've been doing for a while. Vahé Oshagan, like the scholars and writers of his generation, self-consciously did engage in sustained archive making. And his 15,000-page archive in his home is a testament to that. Second principle of displacement, diaspora Armenian life also means critically engaging with intellectual currents of those cultures that Armenians around the world encounter. As Beledian states in Ülmesekian's film, one cannot find a page in Oshagan where there is an imitation of Beckett. Instead, Oshagan brings into the Armenian world the problematics that confront Beckett and thinks of their relevance and significance in the Armenian context. To this double movement of displacement and having carved for himself and for the diaspora Armenian culture a space of a free public intellectual, Oshagan, like poets before him, such as Nigoros Sarafyan, and those after him, like Grigor Beledian, creates, emancipates, allows the emergence of a space that is closest to what can be thought of as diasporic becoming. Thank you. I'm happy and delighted to answer your questions and to continue the conversation. I skipped some parts, but I can speak about those things too. No pressure. Please, Haku.
Thank you, Karen, for this. I intrigued by the writings in Bakin.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, since you mentioned that they've been writing about literature happening all around the world, and so which is, I think, fascinating of Beirut of the 1960s. But how about covering regional, like, for example, Arabic or political events happening and literary events in Egypt, Palestine, Iraq at the time, because there was a lot happening in the region.
This is a wonderful question, and it kind of exposes my weak side, which is a lack of knowledge of Arabic. But I'll say a couple of things about Bakin and try to contrast. So in my readings, Bakin does not engage too much with things regional, which is symptomatic. But Young Armenian, Yerda Sartai, the publication that I showed afterwards, was specifically basically created to talk about things regional geopolitics especially. And so I would recommend looking at Yerda Sartai to understand. And the shift is very important. And I'm guessing the Yerda Sartai was actually created because of such a lack of probably groundedness, let's say. But then there's also Oshagan, the other literary periodical that was created first in the late 60s. I think the first 69 probably, yes. And there in Oshagan, you can actually find translations of Arabic poetry for the first time in an Armenian periodical. And so that debate probably happened in both ways. Yes. Aside from that, I don't know of any other platforms. Nothing really comes to my head. But that's a wonderful question. I think it has to be addressed in seriousness. It has to really be systematically addressed, that question. Yeah. Catherine, please.
Yes, so thank you, Karin, for this kind of encapsulated version of so much Oshagan's oeuvre. And so I'm trying to understand also the connections between the different literary forms and him as literary critique. And you use the heuristic of form, or maybe tools of form and of language. And there's clearly foundation comes in your conclusion as important, something that was drawn in some of the different literary forms that you discuss, whether it's the epic and the use of the epic of Sassoon, and then to go through it and then to go beyond it, right? The city, right? And I wondered, is diaspora also another form? And throughout you use these temporal adjectives of acting, of searching, at the end of becoming, of writing, right? And at some point you even mention a process, right? The act and the process, right? And from what I understood is that in at least at a certain time, for Oshagan himself to have gone through that process of writing, right? And then for his readers, however much of an elite they may be, to have gone through that and to explain to them too how to read, right? In some way, at least in one of your examples that you brought, so the meta-narrative was explicitly written so that you don't go wrong.
Yeah,
right?
it's there.
So, I guess as a historian, I'm also curious about the importance of temporality. But then, where would you place diaspora also within your analytics, right? Of how you have interpreted this larger utopia.
Yeah, it's a good question. What you said about this presentation is accurate. Of course, there's the heuristic or the open-ended concept of form, almost like a non-concept kind of. But in terms of temporality, I guess I can say maybe one or two things about temporality. The historiographic plays are really interesting. I mentioned briefly Vartan Mamegonian. There is another play, or a text that looks like a play or could be a play. This is the hybridity. It's called Avarayr Utsun, Avarayr 80, which is about Vartan Mamigonian's the war with the struggle against the Sassanid Empire. It's the Sassanid, if I'm not mistaken. And what's interesting about these plays is that they are revisiting the national past, let's say, from a diasporic perspective. And so, for me, temporality changes in both ways. Both the past becomes diasporic, but also it sort of sustains the diaspora, that past. It opens up to diasporic becoming. That past, which has always been interpreted as a national past, or the dominant interpretation is national. It's that those events basically secure the national identity of Armenians as Christian, etc., etc. And Vahé Oshagan is very self-conscious about the kinds of historiographic transgressions he's making, and so it introduces a very interesting, very layered, not unidirectional sense of temporality when it comes to his practice or his way of opening up to diaspora. There are sets of decisions he makes, consciously or maybe unconsciously, that are diasporic in my view, and there are these multi-directional temporal openings that happen.
I guess I was wondering, from your own descriptions, that there's a very different kind of conception of diaspora that he's developing, right?
Yes.
When you began to talk about diaspora, you fell onto this more sort of normative ways in which of estrangement, of displacement, that we've come to talk about diaspora. Yes. But then, from your analysis, it seems like he has a very different conception of it.
Yes. I guess it remains to be seen. I'm not. This is very much a work that's forming. And so I asked myself that question: how would I capture Vahé Oshagan's kind of the crux of his notion of diaspora, if there is such a thing, and or would I? But it's a wonderful question. I wake up with that question, and I go to bed with that question. Yes, Harald, and then Arthur.
Any parallels or any influences, again, going back to Vahé Oshagan, not necessarily his writing, but the Vahé Oshagan's, where they wanted to create the space, the culture without the land, without I can't remember how they formulated.
Without soil, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know how exactly they formulated that thing, but this is 1912, 13 maybe, until 15, I think. The day before, I think the last meeting was on April 23rd, 22nd.
Yes.
But they were working on that idea of Kragan Ganku.
Yes. Literary formation, you could even say, Gangnum. The culture without soil is very. It's Vahé Oshagan is. I have shared with some of you in an earlier presentation that paragraph. But the flashes. What was that series called? We did these 5-minute presentations recently, last year. Where he says basically, we don't. Culture is culture. We don't need land. In fact, it's bothering us. So let's forget about land and just do culture. Yeah. That's what he's basically saying. Culture and history. And re-enter history. We don't need land for that. Who needs land? People need land to die in or something. It's just provocative in the regular process. Yeah, but the whole question about Hagop Oshagan, Vahé Oshagan is a thing. It's a wonderful topic, and I hope I will be able to say a couple of things, do some projects with it. But as you know, at the end of his life, Vahé Oshagan started writing this series of historical novels. Again, they are historical novels, and the same kinds of diasporization of the past that is happening here. I suspect, and I would argue that he's doing with those historical novels, which are set in Bursa. And they are enormous echoes with remnants. His novel, Menats Orta, Hagop Oshagan's novel. And so it's a wonderful landscape to bring these two texts together and to reflect basically on the entire 20th century tradition of Western Armenian literature at that point, at least prose. It's a thing. Arthur had a hand, and then Tamar, maybe.
So I want to talk about the relationship between Shahlar and Oshagan.
Mm-hmm.
So you've been using an analytic approach to trace the relationship.
Yes.
You've been doing readings, and very interestingly, actually, Shahlar writes a critique on the martyred writers, just like Oshagan does.
Mm-hmm.
10 years earlier, on Lupin Jallatyan
Mm-hmm.
and his short story Kampel,
Mm-hmm.
much like you describe Oshagan does. And have you been able to maybe read other people's works and to compare the two? And the second question is have you been able to trace maybe a correspondence between Vahé Oshagan and Shahan Shahlan? Or maybe through someone like Kıriko Şahinyan, where in that correspondence maybe he describes Vahé Oshagan's work. Shahlan himself describes.
Oh, the relation between.
So the opposite of what you presented. Vahé
Okay.
Oshagan describing Shahlan.
So regarding correspondence, I haven't. It's a good thought. It's an interesting thought. But what's striking to me is that Vahé Oshagan, already in the 60s, after Paris, of course, he doesn't. My feeling is that he doesn't need Shahanur or anyone else to be provocative. He's already doing his thing, in a way. But as for Zartarian, what was the question?
So,
The relationship between.
Basically, Shahlar did what Oshagan does 10 years earlier.
Yeah, let's say
so
the.
have you been able
I see, the provocative sort of language. Now, that's a good point in a sense because, in a sense that anyone who has read Nahan Jaran's Yerki, The Retreat Without Song, will attest to the provocativeness of the language. And in places, Shahanur is even more masterful at it than Vahé Oshagan. He will lambast Grigor Narigatsi easily as well, Shahanur, etc. So maybe in that sense, there's their keen spirits, as the saying might go. I think Vahé Oshagan would probably appreciate that kind of awake and daring attitude. But as for clear, as for distinct connections or texts, I haven't really found any. Yeah, but I will keep thinking about that. Yes.
I was actually going back to Catherine's point about kind of reformulating this idea of diaspora, because in a way, it seems like what you're arguing is that, like, the relationship to being a diasporan is in and of itself absurd and like existential, right?
Yes.
And it's a very different kind of narrative of diasporan literature than we have, let's say, of 19th century nationalistic writers, right? And in that absurdity, you mentioned in your talk many moments where language is the absurd, right? So, like, you were talking about Beckett, like, and you made that quote about how, like, if people don't have God, they lose, like, something about they lose everything,
Yes,
right?
yes.
So, and let's say in Godot or No Exit, in Beckett's play, right? Like, the absurdity leads to the character's kind of loss and nihilism, where nothing exists, right?
Yes.
Because they're waiting for Godot. But here, the absurdity doesn't lead to that kind of loss and nihilism, right? Because there has to be an existence still in the absurd, right?
Yes.
And that very much is the way, that I think the diasporan character or person is being defined. So
Yes.
how do you still exist in the absurdity, right?
Yes.
Particularly in the absurdity of language, which has a taste of the rotting corpse in the mouth, right? And where you're in a language that is very different to, right, the silence around you, or the silence is the language. So I think your question is actually really like a beautiful angle and way of thinking about the relationship to the outside world, right? And to the absurdity that is very much inherent in the work. So I don't know, I think that's really nice.
Yeah, I agree, and
because I think that's what you're really saying in a way.
Yes,
from what I'm
that's what
understanding.
he's saying,
but
more
what he's
than I
saying, right,
actually.
right. That's right.
He's doing that. He's saying, well, there's this absurd conversation. Well, look at this, aren't we absurd in that
Right.
sense? Look at our diasporic kind of
It's like everything
existence.
is an absurdist translation.
Yes.
Right?
But so what fascinates me is the fact that he comes up with this idea of Vahé Oshagan already in the 60s, but then he keeps it alive and blooming all the way up until he's at the end of his life. He manages to keep it fresh. He keeps rethinking it. Of course, we know after what happens after the vogue period of existentialism. It quickly dies down, and then there is postmodernism, post-structuralism, postmodernism coming in. And I know, and I've seen books in Vahé Oshagan's home with Foucault and his references to Derrida, so he knows about them, but in so many ways, in an interesting way, he keeps using this absurdist language, but he gives it fresh meaning, and he keeps insisting on them in a new way. That's fascinating to me. He doesn't just like wake up, okay, now it's postmodernist time, let me just switch to postmodernist ways of thinking about the diaspora. One great contrast between him and Grigor Buledian is precisely that tectonic kind of difference. Buledian is a postmodernist. I mean, not to reduce him into that space, but he's inspired in a similar way that Vahé Oshagan is inspired by this in a creative way. But Oshagan keeps doing it. And for instance, the Badvas, for instance, this novel is from 1990s. I didn't have the chance to read it. Again, there is that language, and he tries to give it a new turn, as it were. So it's very generative for him.
Right, but I think as writers too, it's like you're really writing about yourself, and your own struggle.
Yes.
Right? So it makes sense that is recursive.
Yes.
Because the thing is, there is no solution really, right? So it becomes a recursive question.
Yeah.
I think for Buledian, he has different ways of, trying to solve the question, But just a thought,
Yeah, that's a wonderful one. I think in terms of their style, the way they handle, and this is Buledian's way of saying, the way they handle sentences and the breath and the word, they're completely different writers. But one last comment, I think the discourse of the absurd is flexible enough and it's open enough to receive these changes. It's you can do lots of things with it, and Vahé Oshagan is an example of that. Yes.
Just coming back to Thomas' comment, it was so clear yesterday when he was talking about himself that he's not searching for an answer.
Right.
I mean, he was saying that a little step towards the truth may just be enough, right? In this sort of sense, so there's no resolve. Right. It's this meaningless, this chaos. Right. Seem to drive him.
Which makes sense with the absurdist or like the common or the nihilist kind of like philosophy, right? When you've already succumbed to the answer is not.
Yeah, and the film begins. In the beginning, there was no beginning. There's poetic pan, but there's also the Bible, but there's also a postmodernist way of saying forget about meaning. Again, within an absurdist manner. Manuel, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to build off of Professor Rostom's question. So in Lebanon, we are often ridiculed as a community for not being able to, after 100 years, still not being able to talk Arabic properly. But my question is, since we're talking about diaspora, why is he constantly looking to the West, and why is he engaging with these big canonical names, Western names, and why is he not? Did you encounter him engaging with Arab writers or poets? Because this is a period of a flourishing of Arabic literature coming out of Egypt and Syria and Lebanon and Iraq. And the other question is. And also in Professor Rustam's seminar, we had a colleague who would come and made a comment that literally rings in my ear up until now, and she said that we often quote or refer to, whenever we're going to write theory, we look at Western thinkers, whether all the big names that I'm not going to name right now. Why don't we look at, let's say, people from our region for theory when we're writing history? So this is really interesting for me. This is a man who's lived in Lebanon and Beirut, and I don't know if you encountered this. I don't know, why is he not engaging with Arabic literature, or I don't know. This is really interesting. It seems like he seems that it's very, and you said this, it's symptomatic. It's emblematic of the detachment from the milieu. I don't know what to say about this. It's really interesting.
I agree with you. I've talked about this to Tallinn Voskerjan as well, who Vahé Oshagan was his uncle, and so she told me a couple of things. So I also do a little bit of anthropological sort of like work. I did interviews with Tallinn this couple of weeks ago. I asked, okay, yeah, he's your uncle, but what else? Tell me more. When you realized that he's this poet, how did you feel? What happened? So I have this, and this is the question in the back of my mind. And Tallinn told me that Vahé Oshagan knew about this literature, but he was sort of obsessed with the idea of diaspora, and he felt that, well, there are these things happening, but there's my idea, and I'm just going to try to pursue it as far as I can. And his formation, his education, he did a PhD in the Sorbonne in Paris. So some things are consequential, I guess, or inevitably so. But it's a great question.
In the film, there are the lists of the universities that he thought when he returned to Lebanon, and one of them is Makhasid College.
Yes.
Which is not. Which is it's not.
It's
so
rare.
He teach French literature all over. Now it's BCW, now BUC, AUB, Paygazian, and Makhasid.
Well, the reason.
Also, college, international college. So he was in touch with that world.
And
AUB, of course.
Yeah.
So he was in touch with that world, and I've seen pictures of him with So, but I don't know about influences. That's a good question.
Well, what I was going to say is that Vahé Oshagan taught at Makhasid College, yeah, because the Armenian institutions rejected and refused to hire him. When he returned from Paris, they were like, no, you're doing this crazy thing. We want a solid teacher. So that's why he went and started teaching in anywhere he could, basically. But it answers the concern, Manuel, your question, and Harkin, your question, about him being in touch or not. He could not be in touch. He could not be exposed, but it didn't permeate, interestingly enough. It took maybe 10 years for that movement to start, with Ahegan, for instance, which is more formally open. It's doing that, basically. But I think it's a great question because it's also part of the diasporic experience of this sort of like ghetto, certain kind of a specific kind of ghettoization we're talking about. And it's still a relation with the other. Like Jallatyan says in his 50 years of literature France, this ghetto is it's one relation.
And the Lebanese milieu allows it to happen. It's very different than France, for example.
And then there's those other structural reasons, sort of like the post-Ottoman millet system, communal system, which, yeah.
Right, so thank you so very much, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.